So my name is Sean Beckett. I'm the program coordinator over at North Branch Nature Center. It's really my pleasure to have you all here and to have Bill and Kim to share their new book with us. We've never done an online virtual book launch. I don't know if anyone has, so it's an exciting new territory for all of us, and all signs point to it being a success so far. I will, before going any farther, I guess I'll just turn it over quickly to Samantha from Bear Pond Books, if you want to tell us a little bit about how people might be able to acquire this.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're very happy to co-host with the North Branch Nature Center to bring you Bill Mayers, one of the co-authors of this beautiful book. I brought the book to hold it up and show everybody. This sticker means that it is autographed. It's a beautiful hardcover book. It's really nice. It's available anywhere that books are sold. We would love for you to support Bear Pond Books. We're an independent bookseller in Montpelier, Vermont. I'm going to put up the link. Oh, where's my chat box? There it is. Put up the link in the chat box. We do free shipping, and we also do free backdoor pickup for anybody local. They can pick it up at the back door. So there's the book link if you're interested, and I hope everybody gets their questions answered and has a great time with Bill and with Kim Greenwood as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Samantha. So I guess I'll briefly introduce Kim and Bill. So Kim is on several boards. She's from Duxbury, on the Vermont Beekeepers Association board. She is recently appointed Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. And it's been a delight to get to know over the last few weeks as we've been putting together this program. And then Bill Mayers, the current president of the Vermont Beekeepers Association, has been president of the Eastern Apicultural Association, and all around longtime beekeeper. I'm not sure exactly how long Bill has been keeping bees, but I can tell you that I was actually a high school student of Bill's at Champlain Valley Union High School back in 2003. And in 2003, Bill gave me this really cool t-shirt from a jazz festival he went to, and it smelled strongly of honey at the time. So I know that in 2003, he was an avid beekeeper. So it turns out that nothing has changed about that. So with that, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Bill, and take it away.
Great. Well, gosh, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Samantha. This is a great experience, and welcome to all of you, people who have come from, now it seems like around the country, especially the folks from Texas. I grew up in Dickinson, Texas, near Houston and Galveston. So yeah. I'm hoping that you all will enjoy this. This book came about, well, let's see, 7 years ago at a summer meeting of the Vermont Beekeepers Association. And I had written a book about the whole American beekeeping industry called Bees Besieged several years ago. And somebody said, you know, we really ought to do something about Vermont's history because it's rife with interesting characters and interesting developments. And this came from a guy from Hardwick, Larry Karp, who became one of our co-authors. And so we put together this team of people to write this book. And obviously we're very proud of it. But we're proud to be part of this historical development of beekeeping in Vermont, which while small, has had significant influence through some of its practitioners. And so Sean, why don't you do the first slide? John Weeks was a businessman in the town of, oh, I never remember, it was, I think it's Salisbury, but he had one of the first patented beehives. It was a big spate of beehive construction, various people around the country trying to figure out how to have bees and not kill them when you extracted the honey. And this was, and his hive was one of the more successful, but it still didn't crack the atom of beekeeping, which was done by a clergyman named Lorenzo Langstroth in 1851. And that really launched beekeeping throughout the entire country, along with Vermont. Next slide. And this is my favorite Vermont beekeeper. This is a guy who was a harness maker in Waitsfield. And then in the Civil War, he joined the Vermont Regiment and fought at Gettysburg and was wounded. And guys on either side of him were killed, but he survived and he came back to Vermont. And 4 years later, he decided to take up beekeeping. And then within about 15 years, next slide, he had something like 700 hives. That's him down on the lower right-hand corner. And he was the largest beekeeper in Vermont. And this is one of his yards just outside the town of Bristol. And so there was, as in the rest of the country, there was a state of beekeeping on a professional level through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Next slide. And showing the heterosexual quality of beekeeping in Vermont. This is a group probably in Addison County. We're not sure where the town is. It could be Ferrisburg, it could be Cornwall, it could be well, Orwell. We're not sure because there was no identification on the photograph. But if you look in the back, the white boxes, this was a common way of doing bees, was to have this in order to keep the rain off. But eventually we no longer use that because they're hard to use. When you take the top off, they sort of rock when you put them on the ground. But nonetheless, look at, you got the women with prizes and very serious beekeepers in the state of Vermont. Next.
Bill, I can't imagine keeping bees in those kinds of outfits.
I know, yeah, yeah. And this is one of my favorite pictures. I wish we had a better identification for it. It appeared in a book of Vermont photographs, but with no identification. But it really shows, here's the father or the grandfather showing his intent son or grandson, a very good frame of bees, very healthy. And so this was widely practiced by individual farmers, but also by professionals who had sometimes 40, sometimes 100, sometimes 200 hives. And it was mostly until the 1870s, 80s, it was all honey that was in comb, and they had very primitive ways of separating the comb from the wax. Well, then along came a series of inventions. One was an extractor, one was a laminator to make a comb foundation, and one was a smoker, which used really an important tool to calm the bees. And this was really beekeeping technology 140, 50 years ago, and it still is what we use. Okay, next. And this guy, this is the 1950s. This is a guy named Dr. D F Jarvis. He was an MD, an internist, but he got really interested in honey and as a palliative, as something that he promised would cure all kinds of ills. And he wrote a book called Folk Medicine in the 1950s, and it ended up selling something like 2 million copies. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. And some people called him a quack, but he never promised that it was going to cure things. He just said it may not make them better, but it's not going to make them any worse. So he even was so famous that, the next slide, there was a cartoon about him in a New Yorker, 1960. And the caption of the pharmacist says, "Look, if honey and vinegar were better than Oreomycin, I'd be selling honey and vinegar and not Oreomycin, wouldn't I?" So he was quite famous, and he never got sued. But a lot of people read his book and said, you can't cure all this stuff with honey and vinegar. But he was famous, and he was this great Vermont beekeeper, or really a user of honey. Next slide. Charlie Morais is another legitimately famous Vermont beekeeper. He came to Vermont in the 1920s from New York, and he built up a business which is now the third generation. His grandson is now running it, Champlain Valley Apiaries in Middlebury. And he got he had a world reputation for developing queens and for some of his techniques. He wrote hundreds of articles for beekeeping magazines. And so I think several years ago, one of the beekeeping magazines picked out the 5 most important beekeepers in the United States in all history, and he was one of the 5. And here he is in Middlebury, Vermont. Next. And this is another woman, from also from Middlebury. She and her husband were, they started in Manchester, Maxine Manchester, and they had 3 generations of beekeepers. And she went on to be the first secretary of the Eastern Apicultural Society, which is still one of the prominent national beekeeping societies in the world or in the country. Next. And this is a guy who taught me beekeeping. This is a retired geologist who spent his life looking for diamonds all around the world, but retired to Waterford, Vermont. And he was like the Pied Piper of beekeepers. And he would go around teaching people beekeeping. And that was, 50 years ago when he started me off. And I promised that when I got to be his age, I'd do the same thing in helping other people. And fortunately, I lived up to that promise. Okay, next. Okay, Kim asked me to read just one little excerpt from our preface to this book about summing up at least part of it. This study provides a microcosm of Americans' relationship with bees, the farming for intellectuals, in Sue Hubbell's lively phrase. The Land of Milk and Honey will explore the relationship between the people of Vermont and the countryside they inhabit. A land and people that shift and change through the centuries in ways that directly affect the health and well-being of bees and beekeepers. One region of Vermont, Addison County, exemplified the matrix between bees, forage, fruits, and dairy cattle, a veritable land of milk and honey. It would continue to produce roughly half of all Vermont's honey. Okay, Kim.
Bill, I got so wrapped up in what you're saying, I actually forgot I was going to talk tonight. But I will. I'll keep going. So I'm going to kind of fast forward us. The book has some really credible history from the past that for me was all news and really, really interesting in terms of setting the context of beekeepers today. I'm a relatively new beekeeper. I started about 15 years ago. So my history and my contributions to the book kind of started with more modern day times, whereas Bill's and the other authors did a ton of research looking at the history of Vermont through the ages, which really provides a really interesting context to beekeeping, that this is a really rich and important part of Vermont's history. So starting in around the 1990s, we started seeing some really serious bee diseases in Vermont. And some of you may have heard about varroa mites, but this was around the time that something called tracheal mites hit. When tracheal mites affected bees in the trachea, it was a really serious pest for bees. And it really was the beginning of kind of this new set of problems in beekeeping that we hadn't seen before. So tracheal mites appear and varroa mites appear. And for those of you who don't know what a varroa mite is, the best way that I can describe it is picture a tick on your back between your shoulder blades, the size of a paper plate, sucking the life out of you. And that's what it's like for a bee. That's the same size equivalent. They transmit diseases, they weaken bees, they're really difficult to treat. And they, starting in the 90s, became kind of the reality of keeping bees today. That's very different from the reality during the times that Bill was speaking of. Next slide, please. So to respond to this, the Vermont Beekeepers Association, which we'll tell you a little bit more about, but Vermont Beekeepers Association is the overarching beekeeping organization in Vermont, and we provide a ton of education and support. I mean, our sole reason for existing is to support beekeepers and help them succeed. So in response to these new threats coming on board, VBA really started ramping up its on-site workshops, in-hive workshops, which is a very different learning experience than learning from a book or learning from somebody else. To have an instructor in a hive talking you through what you're seeing is incredibly valuable. So in 2002, between 2002 and 2005, the Vermont Beekeepers Association started doing workshops in Addison, at the Intervale, and in Heartland, and those are all going today. And in addition, in 2006, at Champlain Valley, Bill and some of his other fellow beekeepers have been teaching classes there. And between 2006 and 2018, they've educated over 700 new beekeepers and provided a really valuable platform for dealing not only with tracheal mites and varroa mites, but with all the other challenges that come with beekeeping. So despite all this support in the early 2000s, a lot of beekeepers got out of beekeeping because the tracheal mites knocked out their bees, and the varroa mites were just coming on board, and we hadn't yet learned as well to live with varroas on the bees, and we were working towards trying to kill the varroa, which is trying to kill an insect on an insect, which presents its own set of challenges. So we lost a lot of beekeepers in Vermont in the early 2000s because of that. And think of bees, they're not like dogs and cats that you can just go out and get one any time of year. They need, like, you can't get them in the fall because they need enough honey stores to go through the winter. So they're very cyclical. Think of them more as like growing a vegetable crop, that you can't plant pumpkins in October and think you're going to have pumpkins. So all of these factors together knocked out a lot of beekeepers, and they weren't able to restart their hives in time for spring. Next slide, please. So in 2006, colony collapse disorder hits the country, and it is mayhem in the beekeeping world. It is like chaos, and for the first time in a long time, we had the full attention of the world. Everyone was trying to figure out what's killing the bees. The rumors about what was going on with CCD were entertaining, to say the least. They were everything from radio towers to cell phones to rare diseases and people, all kinds of theories that were going on. And there's some good sides and bad sides to this. The good sides are everyone wanted to know how the bees were doing. Everyone was concerned about it. And we saw one of the biggest surges in beekeeping that we had seen in the history of beekeeping in Vermont. The first surge was in the 1800s when people started keeping bees. The second surge was in the 60s and 70s when the Back to the Land movement was at its height. And the third big surge in beekeeping in Vermont was when CCD hit, because there were so many people saying, what can I do to help the bees? I want to get started. My children want to get started. We want to save the bees. And all of a sudden, beekeepers kind of became the unlikely and unwilling hero at lots of cocktail parties, because everyone wanted to know what was going on with the bees. Next slide, please. So new beekeepers, and we've all been one, have a lot of questions. There's a lot to learn about beekeeping, and one of my personal favorite quotes about it is, if you think you don't know much about beekeeping, wait till next year. Because no matter how long you've been doing it, there are questions that will come at you that you have never seen before. And so new beekeepers need a lot of support to answer all these questions, like, what is on this bee? What's wrong with this bee? And in this photo, this is a pollen basket that's quite full. I took this spring, and I still haven't figured out what plant it was getting it from, and I've been looking for weeks. So VBA started to see a huge increase in all these new beekeepers in Vermont wanting to save the bees and start keeping bees. We saw a 600% rise in our regional clubs, and we have had clubs in Franklin, Lamoille, Addison, Bennington, the Northeast Kingdom, Central Vermont, the Upper Valley, in the islands, and at UVM. We had clubs all around the state, and many of those clubs are still going. We just saw all these new beekeepers wanting support and information, and we being beekeepers around the state who wanted to help support other beekeepers, set up these clubs. And if you go to the next slide, please, these new clubs really started to support these new beekeepers in hive. And I said this before and I'll say it again, but learning bees in the hive is so much more valuable than reading a book, even an excellent book like ours, Bill. Reading a textbook, it's just not the same. This is a slide of Gib Geiger, who is just an incredible person, a wonderful mentor to a lot of beekeepers, and he opened up his home to tons of beekeepers around central Vermont and hosted these workshops for us. Next slide, please. So a lot of these workshops involve pointing things out, like what is going on in this hive. Gib could be pointing at absolutely anything in this photo, but the sad reality is that it's estimated that 80% of new beekeepers fail in the first year. So they're super excited. They're going to save the bees. They've heard about CCD. They've invested a lot of time and money into getting bees. And then the first winter, their bees die. And that's the sad reality. And that's the reason why all this education is so important to support all these beekeepers. I'm going to read a little quote from one of the folks in our book, who's also just been an incredible mentor to a lot of people over the years. So this is from Jeffrey Cunningham, who's down in Windham County. He's been keeping bees for over 40 years, and he still is. He might even be on the board right now.
No,
anyway.
No.
All right, let me read you his excerpt of his quote. He says, "We tend to focus on, as beekeepers, on bee culture as a branch of agriculture. But what about the culture of beekeepers? Based on my familiarity with beekeeping in Windham County, in contrast to the Champlain Valley and several beekeeping countries I have visited, beekeeping in this corner of our state faces a peculiar poverty of the popular culture and knowledge of beekeeping that would provide new beekeepers with a cultural context you might take for granted in Middlebury or Burlington. This thinness of an informed undercurrent of beekeeping wisdom seems to leave hobbyists more than usually vulnerable to unscrupulous salesmanship and predatory pseudo-tutelage. Use of the internet for apicultural edification has both improved and exacerbated the challenges faced by novice beekeepers in Windham County." And I like that quote because it's a testament to the challenges of being a new beekeeper in the age of the internet, where Google anything, it's like WebMD, and all of a sudden you're dying. That's kind of the same thing with beekeeping. There's a lot of bad information out there on the internet. So new beekeepers were really struggling with this new reality. Next slide, please. So to further support this effort, in 2011, the Vermont Beekeepers Association became a nonprofit, which is an important tool for us in terms of being able to apply for and get grants. And we also, in 2012 or 2013, I forget, because it was many years in the making, hosted the Eastern Apicultural Society. Was it 2013, Bill?
12.
The Eastern Apicultural Society's annual meeting. And this is like, I don't even know, like the Super Bowl of beekeeping. And we had 25 states present, 2 Canadian provinces, and we had about 800 people show up at UVM to learn everything about bees, everything from like, what is this thing called in my hand to what's the latest on research. And we had hives set up on the UVM green, and we had parties, and we had auctions, and we raised money, and we talked bees, and it was years in the making. It was so much fun. And it was just a really great event, and we were really proud to host in Vermont. Part of the reason I tell you this is because I'm obviously very proud of the fact that we were all collectively able to pull this off, but we timed that just right at the height of all these new beekeepers starting up and all these people wanting to know like what's going on with the bees. So we had great press, we had lots of interest, and we were able to secure tons of experts from around the country, like this guy, who could come in and teach bees to Vermonters. It was a pretty awesome thing to have right in our backyard. Next slide, please. One of the things that you either learn the easy way or learn the hard way, but you're gonna learn, is about bears and bees. And this is unfortunately a fairly common sight that will strike terror in the heart of any beekeeper, and that is this apiary was hit by a bear, and this is what it looks like. They actually have some pieces that are still intact, so it's actually not as bad as it could be. But bears are a constant threat for especially for new beekeepers, and something that we continue to educate about to this day. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of this in beekeeping, in modern day beekeeping, of people standing around trying to figure out what they're looking at and what's going on. But there's also obviously a really strong system of camaraderie and mentoring and support for each other. If you're thinking about getting into beekeeping and joining into this wonderful world, you will not be alone. You will be well supported. Next slide, please. Before I turn this back over to Bill, one of the ways that we continue to this day, and this is an old tradition as well as a modern tradition, how we support and educate folks about beekeeping is by showing up at different fairs. And the Vermont Beekeepers Association has had a presence at a lot of fairs over the years. And the one that has remained is the Tunbridge Fair. So it's a big event for us. We go every year. I think it's fair to say that for some of us, it's a tradition that we look forward to every year. We get our spot the day after the fair ends for the next year to show up, and we get to talk to kids and we get to talk to the public, and everyone wants to know how the bees are doing. And it's just a really fun and educational fundraiser for us. So before I turn it back over to Bill, there's kind of like in the modern history of beekeeping, we've had a lot of struggles, but we've also capitalized on the interest in bees to really ride that wave of support and really help Vermont beekeepers to succeed in their efforts in this, what is kind of a challenging hobby. So I'm going to turn over to Bill. He's going to talk through some of the modern day beekeeping heroes.
Good. All right, Sean, next slide. This is Mike Palmer, in my opinion, the best beekeeper in Vermont. He's lives in St. Albans, and he's been doing this for, oh gosh, since '73. And he has about 1,000 hives, and he raises queens, which he's now doing now. He's putting queens in little cages, which he then sells. He also sells what are called nucleus colonies. But he's just a marvelous beekeeper, and he's always willing to answer questions, and he gives classes all around well, not just around Vermont, but he's been sent to or brought to New Zealand, to Canada, to England, to Ireland, giving 2 or 3 weeks worth of talks. And so he really is one of the giants. He's up there with Charlie Morais for Vermont beekeeping fame. Okay, next. This is Steve Reese, who was two inspectors ago. He was the inspector for 20 years, from early 90s to early 2010 or 11. And here he's giving a class at the Intervale in Burlington. Okay, next. Mike Willard is only been keeping bees for 5 or 6 years or 7 years, but he's been an incredible success. I mean, there literally is always, those are all full of honey. Everything above the pink on the right and everything above the 2 bottoms on the left. And this is he's a marvelous. He will be the next Mike Palmer if he would do this full time, but he actually has a day job. But anyway, he's a great guy. Next. Meryl Tenenbaum is probably the oldest still sort of working beekeeper in the state. He's from up in Franklin County, and this is his grandson, who's also taking up bees. Okay. This is me cutting down a swarm in Burlington. I mean, it's a swarm that has been up there for a month. I mean, they had time to build all that wonderful comb. And for those of you who care about the history of beekeeping, if you look at the yellow combs and then what's dark in between are bees, and is called bee space. That's the 3/8 of an inch that bees themselves construct in order to allow them to work both sides of the comb. And it was through the discovery and illumination of that notion of bee space was the really breaking of the atom in beekeeping by Langstroth, because he figured out a way to make a removable frame to pull out the frame with the honey, get rid of the bees, not kill them, but shake them off, and then shake the honey out, put the frames back in. And that really did revolutionize beekeeping. Next. Yeah, this is John Drayton up in Eden, I think, right? Eden?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's out checking his bees.
This is last week.
Oh, in front of his got his electric fence out there, and anyway, we also have a picture of old Manham from Bristol in almost the same pose, but 140 years ago. Okay, next. Yeah, and this is some of the books that were done about Vermont beekeeping before ours. So it's we're trying to put ourselves on the map. Ross Conrad, co-author here, he did this book, Natural Beekeeping, and then Honey and Health is from Charlie Morais, and Jarvis's Folk Medicine, and Rowan Jacobson's Fruitless Fall. Okay, next. This is one of yours, Kim, right?
Yeah, I guess just to wrap it up, I love this photo because there is a bear fence there, but it just, to me, kind of wraps up like why we keep bees. It's a beautiful hobby, and you meet incredible people. And this book, to me, even though I helped write it, it really opened my eyes to the framework in which today's beekeeper sits in the context of Vermont beekeeping. Next slide, please. And I've said this for many years that I get to the fall and I forget that we're getting honey too, because the beekeeping itself is so rewarding that when the honey comes along, it's like this bonus thing of keeping bees. So with that, we'd love to open it up for questions and hear from you all. Any questions that you have about the book or about beekeeping in general.
And feel free to throw your questions over in the group chat. There's one that's been in there since the beginning. First of all, thank you both. There's a question from Betty in Montpelier wondering about what Vermont's doing to prepare for the Asian giant hornet.
I'd say nothing.
I hope I'm in the cold ground by the time we get to Vermont. These are the questions that people asked about killer bees back in the 70s, and they haven't gotten to Vermont. And I don't want to be frivolous about this, and yeah, they're serious, and but we've got far more and greater problems to deal with than Asian hornets right now. So when they come, I'm going to worry about them, but I'm not going to do it right now.
And let's see. Oh, what's the policy for swarms of bees? Is it finders keepers, or is there a way to find the owners?
Oh gosh, that's a great question, because
Super relevant question.
well, we wrote about it in the book, and because I was doing this early history, and it was almost like a stream that disappears in a desert, because in 1947 is the last mention of your rights as a beekeeper to go into someone else's property to collect your swarm, or conversely, for you as the owner of a piece of land to post it and say that if the swarms are in your property, you get to take them. But there's nothing on the books anymore. So I think the rules, I mean, there are no rules. I mean, I think everybody today would say if you go and ask to get the swarm, I've picked up swarms. I happen to be #1 on the swarm collection list on the Beekeepers Association website. So I get calls, 2 or 3 calls a week, and I'd say 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 are real honeybees. They're usually sweat bees or carpenter bees that are under people's, which is another issue. But I think collecting swarms is well accepted, as long as you ask the person where they are, and there's a technique for doing it. I mean, you don't want to be a fool and try to climb 30 feet to get a swarm, but I don't know, Kim, what's your experience?
Yeah, I think most people, this is really kind of a cool thing in beekeeping, is that most people in Vermont call the swarm catchers to see if they can find someone to take bees, as opposed to in other states they're just like reaching for the closest can of whatever to kill them. And we're pretty lucky, so we get a lot of calls and we see a lot of interesting places that they end up, from like 30 feet up in the tree to, we had one last summer that was behind the fire station in Waterbury, and it was like eye level, and we walked out and snipped the branch and off we went. I mean, yeah, but the history is interesting, because it used to be if you found the swarm and marked the tree, the swarm was yours, and now it's finders keepers.
Well, and the other change is, since Varroa, is that there are far fewer swarms, maybe 10% of what there were 30 years ago, because the bees can't live through the winter when they're afflicted with Varroa. So people used to increase their apiary by going and collecting swarms. Well, you can't do that anymore. So when you see a swarm, and the ideal time to collect a swarm is within 24 hours of its departure from the hive, because they're really in a temporary holding pattern, a temporary location. They're usually not too high up, and you can go and get them. So it's still as a great sport. And there's a professor at Cornell named Tom Seeley, who's written a book about going in and catching swarms.
Yeah.
Speaking of swarms, one other quick question. You showed that photograph of those combs that were out there exposed on an open branch.
Yeah.
And some of us have seen that a couple of times around the woods, and just wondering about the ecology of that. How does that happen? What's going on there?
I don't know, because the people at the house where they called me, and I went up there within, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours. So it had obviously been up there for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and I think it was very unusual for a swarm to set up an exposed colony, because usually they will have a temporary place they'll go to until they send out these scout bees to find a permanent home, and then they'll go and end up in a tree or something that will be their permanent home. So this was very unusual to find that much wax, that much that many bees in there. We cut it down and put it in a box, and I put it in one of my apiaries.
We had one like that, Bill, here, and it was there all summer through November till when they died from exposure. So it does happen, but it's pretty unusual. I mean, that was a treat to be able to see that every day. It was like, 100 feet up. There's no way we're going to get it, but that is pretty unusual. Collecting the swarm is actually pretty easy because the bees are pretty docile. It's not quite their home yet, so they're not defensive at all, and so you can often just go right up and snip, snip, and off you go.
Yeah, they're all fat too. They're all full of honey because
Right.
they've left their former home. They've loaded up with supplies, and because they don't know how long they're going to be out waiting for their new home, so they're funny and fat, and they are not protecting their home. So you can do this. Well, you should keep a veil, but you can do it by hand. It's kind of cool.
Kim, a question from Mirabelle. How hard was it setting up the hive and getting the bees into it?
That's a great question. Your first hive is absolutely terrifying, and you are certain you are going to kill every bee and they're going to be dead the next day. But the reality is there's not a lot to it. You set your hive body up and the frames, and you take your bees that you've purchased from someone else, or if you're lucky, your swarm that you've captured from the tree, and you bring them over to the hive, and you kind of, depending on what form they're in, you either shake them really hard into the hive, or you just pick up the frames and set them in very carefully, and you have your queen in the cage and you get ready to release her. So while it's nerve-wracking, like you spend your whole day getting excited for this monumental event, picking up your bees and installing them, and it takes like 5 minutes, and then you spend the next 24 hours in terror that you've done something wrong and you've killed them all and everything's fine. So Mirabelle, it's not super hard to do. It's just can be really scary the first time you do it.
Another question. Where does Vermont rank in the national bee honey production? How many hive sites are there in Vermont?
Well, it's a little hard to say. That traditionally the average production of Vermont hives has been around 60 pounds. That's the surplus. That's the honey that you don't leave in the hive for the bees to eat during the winter. And there are, at last count, about 12,000 hives in the state. So you do the math. So what's that, 700, 800,000 pounds of production. And most of that is done by probably 10 beekeepers, or more than 50% is done by people who have more than 100 hives. And there are only a dozen or so of those in the state.
That's kind of an interesting demographic for Vermont, Bill, that the vast majority of our beekeepers are hobbyists, meaning, less than 20 hives or so. There's a few sideliners who have 20 to 50 hives, but most beekeepers, the vast majority, probably 95%, are people who are doing it for the fun of it and not for a livelihood.
Yeah, and the terminology has changed, I think, for the better. I mean, we think this is a hobby. Well, people get kind of half-assed about hobbies, and this is not that kind of a hobby. We either call ourselves sideliners or backyard beekeepers, but it takes work, and you've got to be working with those bees every week, because there's always something to be checked on, treated. So it's not a pastime where you simply put a hive in the garden in June and then go and collect the honey in September. So it's, along with the new pressures on bees from diseases and parasites, comes an added obligation for real care and education. So we really try to persuade people, say, you know, if you want to do bees, that's fine, but it's going to be work. And if you don't want to do it, go get another hobby.
Question from Lawrence Miller. What are the characteristics that seem to make a novice beekeeper successful? Can you compare it to homebrewing as a reference point? And also, another part to this question. We had yet another bear cub in the backyard last night. Are there ways of protecting the hives, or does bear frequency just suggest that it's a bad place?
Why don't you do the bears, Kim? I'll do the other one.
I'll start with the bears up here on Camel's Hump. We have many, many, many stories, but as I've said, for about 15 years, we've got tons of videos and game camera shots of the bear coming up to the fence. But we have, it is Fort Knox up here with the electric fence, and knock on wood, it's been successful. We have 4 strands of fence, and our fencer's good for, I don't even know, like 100 square miles or something crazy, and it's worked. That said, I know friends who have done the same, and the bears have gone right through. And once they go through that fence, there's not a whole lot you can do, and they've had to give up beekeeping because of the bear. So it's one of those things that it ties into the successful novice beekeeper. If you're going to get bees and not get a fence, I don't really want to have that conversation with you, because you've got to have a good fencing system if you're going to have bees, no matter where you are. So that's kind of like non-negotiable aspect. Number 1 is get a good fence, and not a solar fencer. I'd love to hear your advice, Bill, on other characteristics for novice beekeepers. The natural curiosity would be at the top of my list, but.
Well, Lawrence, great. Thanks for the question. And I'd never thought about doing. I've done both of these pastimes, and I think that the similarities are you a good amateur scientist? Are you a good experimenter? Do you take good notes? Do you learn from your mistakes? Do you keep trying different stuff? But are you attentive to your craft? And I think that applies to both of them. And so you can't just sort of lean into this, you know, unless you want to fail, because even good beekeepers fail. But the rewards are commensurately great. That the more you put into this, in intellect and physical engagement, the better the product's going to be.
Another question, actually, a question related to the Fort Knox. Wondering if there's other, well, 2 parts. One is I saw a photograph of that you showed here of the hives in the winter under snow and the electric fence there. I'm wondering if you still maintain electric fencing in the winter, and if there's other animals besides bears that are problematic to the hives.
Those are great questions. So for us with the fence, we keep it on until the snow comes, and till we are sure that the bears are hibernating, and we check that by the tracks that we see up in the woods. But there have been many springs that meaning my husband has spent hours digging out the fence, going down several feet in the snow to clear the snow away from the fence, like in John Crichton's photo, to make sure that we have that fence live in the spring before the snow is melted.
Other animals that one worries about are smaller. Raccoons and skunks are particularly annoying, and so there are ways of what the skunks will do is they'll go and scratch at the entrance to the hive and wait for the bees to come out, and then they'll pop them and they'll eat them. And the raccoons will dig around the hive, and they'll sometimes scratch too. So one of the 25-cent tools that you have is you take a piece of hardware cloth, half-inch hardware cloth, and you pinch it together and you put it right in the entrance, and it's sharp on the end, so none of these creatures will go up and scratch at it. And I put that stuff in and keep it in year round. But they are annoying. And then it also keeps out the voles and mice, which can go in, set up nests and eat the wax. And a funny thing to open up a hive in the springtime and find out a family of mice is leaving.
Question from Jerry. Have you seen a swarm in another country? And I guess I'll add to that, is beekeeping kind of the same game in other countries, or are there major differences depending on where you are?
Well, yeah, beekeeping is practiced almost in every country. And the last 10 or 15 years, I've been working for a nonprofit. We've been teaching, working with coffee farmers in Central America. And one of the alternative supplemental activities we're teaching is beekeeping, because it not only gives them additional income to what they get from coffee, but it also allows them pollination of their gardens. And they're all Africanized, but people have learned how to deal with them. And so that's certainly all throughout South America. There's lots of beekeeping. There's beekeeping in really every country. So I've been to a couple of international conferences called Apimondia, one in Argentina, one was in Montreal last fall, and you get people from 100 countries. And it's like going to the Eastern Apiculture Society at UVM. You get all these, and everybody loves bees. And it's a great love feast, but it's also science-based. So it's really exciting, and to know that you can go anywhere in the world, and if you, with a little bit of work, you could find beekeepers.
And Jerry has another question. You spoke of a beekeeper inspecting a hive. What is he inspecting? What are beekeeper inspectors?
Kim.
Happy to take that one. So the State Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets employs a best case full-time, worst case less than full-time inspector to look at a lot of different things. One of the big ones being there's a disease called American foul brood, which is basically a death sentence for your hive if it's found, and for all the hives around it. It's something that can remain in hives for, we know, 70 years, maybe longer. So when you're passing used equipment around, buying, some beekeeper goes out of business, who wants my old equipment? That's one of the reasons we recommend against that. So the inspector looks at hives to make sure that American foul brood isn't present. They're also inspecting new packages and new what are called nucleuses. So basically new kits of bees coming into the state to make sure that they're disease free. So that's a really critical position. And Mike Palmer, who Bill spoke about, who's not just the best keeper in Vermont, but might be one of the best beekeepers in the country. The way that he describes it is, if these were dairy cows, and if one of your dairy cows got this disease and you had to put down the entire herd, we'd have a very different level of inspection going on in Vermont. And he's right. When you think about it that way, if you get this disease, the consequences are your hive is burned and killed. That's basically the remedy. And while I haven't had it, some of my friends have, and they have said they've cried like babies when they've had to burn their hives. And it's a pretty emotional and terrible thing to go through. So American foul brood is right at the top of the list of things that they're inspecting for. You want to add anything to that, Bill?
Well, yeah, I think it's also the inspector supplies a really important, vital educational element. So it's not just, she's not just a police
no.
an officer enforcing the law. She's an educational person. And so every time she or he, if it's a male, come to be instructed, I always have used that as an opportunity to ask questions about something that's going on. So they but she is only one person. Then she gets some help in the summertime and can't reach everybody's hives but it's really important because it unlike maybe half the other states who don't have bee inspectors, this person under Vermont law has the police power to tell you that you have a diseased colony which is going to affect other colonies within 2 or 3 miles. And if you don't get rid of it, we'll burn it. So it's really important to have that kind of state's power to enforce the beekeeping laws for the benefit of all beekeepers.
That's a great point.
Folks have any other questions? Now is a great time to put them into the group chat. In the meantime, I want to just mention again that I will put the link again into the group chat of where you can go and find this book. Please go and visit Bear Pond Books website. You can buy it right there, get an autographed copy, and you can go and if you're local, you can pick it up right from curbside. And for those of you that are tuning in from California, Texas, farther than driving distance to Vermont, I believe Samantha said free shipping on this book to folks. Is that right, Sam?
It is, yeah. It's media mail shipping, so it does take a little while. The post office is a little slower than usual. So the media mail shipping's free. If you wanted faster service, you can choose to do priority mail. But I just wanted to point again the book. It's so beautiful. I loved seeing, there are hundreds of pictures in here, and I loved seeing pictures like that with the bees and the flowers. And I love the, look at these little guys. The kids in the beehives. So cute. So it's a gorgeous book. Congratulations, guys, and thanks for doing the online event with us.
Thank you. Well, I close with a great quote from Mike Palmer, who despite all we've said about how important it is for you as a beekeeper to really study and practice and so forth, but he always reminds people in his classes that bees are better beekeepers than beekeepers are bees. So think about that one for a while.